He always knew that ice was unforgiving. Even as a child, his grandfather used to tell stories about fishermen who were inadvertently swept into the abyss. He listened to these stories, sitting by the crackling fireplace, and imagined how the ice would part, how the dark water would embrace him, ruthlessly and silently. At the time, it seemed like just a scary fairy tale, but now it has become a reality. He went out on the ice this morning. The winter was harsh, and food was becoming a problem. He was used to these places, knew every channel, every bay. But even experience could not always save him from the unexpected. He needed to check the traps set up in the ice holes last week. If he was lucky, he would find some fish, or at least traces of an animal that could be tracked. The wind was already rising then, piercing to the bones. He pulled his scarf tighter, adjusted his fur mittens, and moved forward, guided by the old markings. When he reached the first ice hole, the ice around him seemed strong. He nudged the ice floe with his boot and looked inside. The trap was empty. He pulled it out, checked it, and moved on, wondering if there would be enough time to make it before sunset. The second and third traps didn't bring any luck either. Annoyed, he walked further into the ice field, hoping for luck. Suddenly, it seemed to him that he noticed movement in the distance. A dark silhouette flashed between the snow swirls. He froze, trying to make out what it was. An animal, a human, or just a trick of his eyesight. His heart sank with a strange premonition, but he continued on his way. It was only when he reached the last ice hole that his wariness increased. The ice looked different here. He crouched down and carefully examined the surface. Thin lines of cracks radiated from the center, as if something heavy had recently hit the icy surface. He looked around, but there was no one around. The feeling of someone else's presence did not leave him. It was at this moment that he heard the first dull crack under his feet. The ice began to slowly but inexorably betray him. He froze, realizing that the next step might be the last, but he had no choice. The wind howled in the void, blowing snow dust across the icy field, as if whispering ancient warnings. The sun was already sinking towards the horizon, its orange light reflected in an endless icy mirror, spreading in crimson flashes along the cracks. His heart was pounding in his chest, drowning out even the whistling of the wind. He looked up. In the distance, beyond the line of gray shadows, a dark strip of shore loomed. Salvation. Home. But there was a shaky surface between him and the solid earth, with a bottomless chasm of ice hidden beneath its thin crust. He knew that the slightest mistake and the water would close over his head, dragging him down into absolute silence. He took a deep breath, barely daring to shift his weight forward. The ice cracked treacherously again. One more step, and the screeching became deafening. Time has slowed down. Images of the past flashed before his eyes. Childhood on these shores, the smell of pines warmed by the sun, the booming laughter of his father, who threw him into the air. It seemed like my whole life fit into an instant. You can't stop. If you stop, the ice will carry you away. He knew that. I've seen it happen to others. I saw how the silent surface swallowed up people without a single sound, without the possibility of escape. Here, in these parts, nature did not forgive mistakes. He shifted his body weight, carefully, almost imperceptibly. Every step is a struggle against panic, with instincts screaming, "Run!" But to run is to fail. There was only caution, only cold calculation. The shore was approaching. A few more meters, a little more. Suddenly, something crunched under his right foot, and the icy surface was instantly covered with a network of cracks. It seemed to him that he was a moment away from falling. Reflexes worked faster than consciousness. He abruptly pushed off, rushed forward, stretched out his arms, trying to reach a solid surface. Winter. A gust of cold air. The ground met him sharply, piercing his body with pain. He was breathing fast, gasping for the frosty air, feeling the icy needles digging into his lungs. And behind him, where he had been a second ago, the ice was crumbling, falling into a black abyss. He lay there, looking up at the sky and listening to the crunching of the brittle stones subside. The wind was still howling, but it sounded different now. There was no threat in it anymore, just a reminder about how close you can get to the edge before you step into the abyss. And suddenly there was a sound. There was a thud somewhere nearby, as if someone was making their way through the snow. He raised his head, and his heart started beating faster again. A dark figure stood at the edge of the forest. A man? He couldn't make out the face, but it was clearly watching him. The man tried to scream, but his voice broke. The stranger took a step forward, then another. He could see it now. It was a tall man in a long raincoat, the hood hiding his face, but his movements were confident, almost noiseless. The stranger came closer, taking his time, then stopped. For a second, it seemed to him that the man was not just watching, but evaluating him, as if deciding whether to help. And so, without saying a word, the man threw something small in his direction. A bundle of thick cloth. There was a dry log and matches inside. The man looked up, but the stranger was already leaving. The dark figure disappeared into the trees as suddenly as it had appeared. Who was it? How did he know that someone was here? Thoughts swarmed in my head, but my body needed only one thing: warmth. With trembling hands, he lit a fire. Flames danced in the frosty air, and only then did he allow himself to close his eyes, realizing how close the end was. And somewhere in the forest, in the snow-covered shadows, the stranger stopped for a moment, looked back and disappeared into the darkness again.